This session looks at how geostrategic rivalry has created a trade war in China, between China and the US. Global supply chains are being disrupted. The effectiveness of multilateral trade institutions are under question. National security concerns are also on the agenda and impacting on business choices. How does business best navigate these choppy waters? It's now my pleasure to invite to the stage Charles Finny, who is a partner in Saunders Unsworth, a former trade negotiator, and a very keen observer of the geostrategic game, particularly as it affects New Zealand and our major partners. Professor James Laurenceson, Deputy Director of the Australia-China Relations Institute, who has at times taken a somewhat contrary view to the what we see reported out of Australia on the relationship between Australia and China, which has been subject to a reasonable degree of China panic. And Andrew Grant, Senior Partner in Auckland for McKinsey and Company, a former head of Greater China for McKinsey, and again has a very well-developed geopolitical viewpoint. Welcome to the stage. Welcome all to this session where we hope to have a fair degree of plain speaking around some of the things we've heard today and just looking forward into the future. This session comes straight off the back of Andrew Bowater's address, and I'll first direct some questions to Charles and James for a response on Andrew's thesis that the steps that they are taking to mitigate GCSB concerns over the national security risk could pass muster. I mean, will it be enough?
Okay, first, it's important for a disclosure. I did do work for Huawei a number of years ago. I haven't for about 5 or 6 years, but I was their interface with GCSB and SIS. Look, I think Andrew did a very good job of putting the case there for Huawei. The problem is when we're in the national security space, it's very difficult to have a proper conversation, and you're never going to know the full story as to why a government might have concerns. I'm fairly confident that there is pressure being applied by some of our important partners in this space, and that is a material fact here. At the end of the day, though, the government's going to have to take a decision. They can't hide behind the officials. Even this new legislation forces a political decision, and the Chinese government will be watching very closely.
Indeed. James?
Look, I guess the thing I would add to that is we're talking about Huawei, but in fact there's a much bigger issue here. In more and more areas of technology, China is the world leader. So I don't think taking the approach of banning every Chinese tech company is a realistic approach going forward. So I think that's the challenge. Even if you do take the step to ban Huawei today, you're going to be having the same conversations next year and in 5 years' time as more and more Chinese tech companies come to the fore. For example, 10 out of the world's top 50 universities in science and technology now are based in China. Australia has one. So that's the world we live in. We need to adjust to that.
I mean, Fran, I also think one thing that helps contextualise a little bit why the Huawei discussion ends up being so central. I mean, the technology point is absolutely an important one to make. If we do look at the basis of geopolitical strategic competition going forward, data and the ownership of data is going to be central to that. And experts, sort of more informed than myself, point out 3 arenas that are going to be critical: healthcare, transactions, and the Internet of Things. The Chinese in transactions, because of Alibaba, Tencent, JD.com, are already 2 orders of magnitude ahead of the US. In healthcare, given what they're doing around individual healthcare records, will be 1 order of magnitude ahead of the US. The Internet of Things ends up being the next frontier. And rightly or wrongly, Huawei finds itself right in the centre of who will own the data that comes off the Internet of Things. So I think that that's just another dimension to why Huawei ends up being so front and centre in the discussion and the debate.
So recently, UK Prime Minister Theresa May decided that Huawei wouldn't be excluded from UK's 5G network build-up, albeit with restrictions. Does this move provide a window for New Zealand to shift its view, Charles?
I think if the New Zealand government did want to change its position, the position we read about the UK government moving to will be very helpful.
Nothing to add. I think that's quite clear. And of course the argument is that the UK government is the government that understands Huawei the best by virtue of those platforms they had for testing their technology over there. So I don't think Australia's going to change its decision, but as Charles said, if New Zealand were going to do it, I think that's now would be about the right time.
As a member of Five Eyes, however, and given the level of rhetoric by Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and others out of the US, and also the, I was going to say, potential outgoing government in Australia, but that may not be the case. But what would be the likely Australian and US response if New Zealand does follow UK and allow Huawei to have a minor role here?
I think it's very difficult for there to be any really serious action taken against New Zealand if the United Kingdom is in a similar position to ours. Also, I think it's important to take into account the fact that the Five Eyes network exists because all five of the eyes are watching and very useful to the other four. And I'd be very surprised if action were taken to cut the UK and New Zealand out of this arrangement.
Fran, could I perhaps add to that? I think you're quite right, Charles, but you know, the Five Eyes clearly have concerns about China. But within the Five Eyes, let's be clear, there's quite a bit of concern about where the US is heading at the moment as well. So the concerns in the Five, I mean, in Australia we have huge debates. Many of you would have heard the comments from the Director of Planning in the US State Department the other day where she said that we, the US, now view China as a threat, and the terms that she couched that threat in were in terms of a civilizational war, and even in racial terms as well. So if that was someone on Fox commentary, or perhaps coming out of the US Defense Department, that might be one thing, but this is coming out of state. These are the US diplomats who are meant to be taking a nuanced view. So that's all happening in the Five Eyes as well. There's concerns about the US, not just China.
But let me make the point also that there was the recent FBI report just prior to Christmas which did instance concern, and New Zealand also was part of that, about cyber incursions by China, and mentioning for the first time state-sponsored cyber hacking. So I think we've got an issue there where New Zealand did stand on that one, and then has also been drawn into the Western hemispheric response on 5G.
And the New Zealand government did the right thing to take a stand on that issue. We should not be allowing any other jurisdiction to engage in state-sponsored activity of that type, and we should be calling it out when it occurs.
Okay, next issue, foreign interference. Now, obviously, this audience is well aware of the Anne-Marie Brady paper that came out at the end of 2017, which has sparked a debate here, but it hasn't had the heat of what's happened across the Tasman in Australia. But nevertheless, a parliamentary select committee is looking at whether there was any degree of foreign interference at the last elections. And this, let me make clear to this audience, is not a China-specific issue. It could just as easily relate to Russia, North Korea, all of which have been active in recent years. So, Charles, is there an issue here?
Yes, I think there is obvious evidence that jurisdictions of our type have been subject to this type of interference in recent years. There could have been some low-level interference last election. I watch these things very closely and don't have any really concrete evidence, but I wouldn't rule out that it occurred, and I wouldn't rule out that it will occur in the future, and I think we need to be extremely vigilant. I think there are some other issues sort of tied up in this piece of debate around the funding of our political parties, and I think we do need to have a debate in New Zealand about what we want for the future and maybe some changes.
So this debate in Parliament could be quite healthy?
Yeah, I see it as a very healthy thing, nothing to be worried about.
Okay. James, the readout on the Australian debate is quite different. It's been very heated, there's been accusations in Parliament, a broad-ranging inquiry and also changes to legislation. Can you give us a perspective on that?
Yeah, sure. So first of all, there's nothing wrong with the debate. Okay, that's a good thing. I think we should welcome that. Also, some of the concerns that people have about Chinese interference, whether it's in Australia, I won't comment on New Zealand, but there are some genuine concerns here, and I don't think we do the debate a service by denying them. Let's face it, some of China's actions are not helpful, right? And I think China has made this worse by some of its actions. I won't go through, there's quite a long list. I mean, we could look at the South China Sea, for example. In 2016, we have an international ruling saying that China's actions there don't conform to international law. So I think it's entirely appropriate that countries like Australia and New Zealand call that out. We could talk about what's happening in Xinjiang at the moment, where you have members of China's minority Uyghur population detained. That is hugely concerning for countries like Australia and New Zealand that are concerned about human rights. So let's have the debate. Let's admit that there are genuine concerns here, but at the same time, I think what the Australian debate has shown us, Fran, is that that debate has to be conducted on the basis of facts and evidence. Otherwise, what happens is you have this massive polarisation of the debate. It becomes driven by egos, and you don't actually have you don't have the two sides talking to each other. And certainly that's what we've seen in Australia, and I think it's been completely counterproductive, and it's meant that it's actually been very hard for Australia to move the debate forward. I could give you examples. At the end of last year, I wrote a report called Australia Talks China. Do the facts stack up? I won't go through the 6 chapters, but what I will say is whether you're talking about political donations, Chinese students, Chinese investment, perhaps most importantly and disturbingly, Chinese Australians having their loyalties called out on the basis of a lack of facts and evidence. I mean, I think that's hugely counterproductive for addressing the genuine concerns that that do exist.
Yes, and I think on that score, what's also instructive is there's been a wide range of defamation settlements this year, or defamation awards, against various news media in Australia, which have essentially hung out to dry the reputations of some prominent Chinese Australians without having all the facts. And one of the things which, on a personal front, has concerned me about extrapolating out the Brady paper here is that we could set ourselves up for similar. And that's something that we would want to avoid. So just moving along, what would be good to have a look at, I think, is talking with you, Andrew, about there is a new era now in China with President Xi Jinping. And you've studied what that means from both a McKinsey perspective, but also for clients. And I wondered if you could give us a readout on that.
Well, look, I do think that we are in a new era, and we're in an era that's probably the most, if you look from Deng Xiaoping through, in many respects it was incremental to the past. This is more of a step change, probably even more of a step change from Mao to Deng Xiaoping in terms of what we've seen. I think in terms of some of the positive sides of that, in terms of where we can work with, one is we've talked about BRI this morning. The only thing I would add around BRI, I think people often put the decimal place in the wrong point about how meaningful it actually is. BRI, some people have talked about it being by an order of magnitude the most significant economic and diplomatic set of actions of our age. Some others have dimensioned it as being 1,000 times the size of the Marshall Plan, and it touches every part of China. So I think New Zealand has to be engaged with BRI, and we have to have a long-term plan that's not just 30,000 feet, we might do this, we might do that. I think we have to have a very strategic long-term view of what will New Zealand's involvement be. And I also, picking up on something Minister Parker said, China is very sensitive around some of the criticisms around places like Sri Lanka and others. New Zealand can really add something there. So I would say one thing, I do think having a genuine strategic plan around how we engage, we often think, well, our strategic plan is our FTA. In my view, an FTA is a component of a strategic plan. It's not the plan in of itself. Therefore, I think we need to elevate the quality and the substance of the strategic thinking. The other thing that Xi and Li have brought is just this, they really do think long-term. The mayor of Beijing, with their sponsorship, is currently putting together a 100-year plan for Beijing to be the scientific capital of the world. And they're actually serious about... So I think we need to have something that's symmetrical with that sort of substantive around timeframes and quality of thinking. I don't think yet we've got a true counterweight to that level of thinking yet that I think we did with the FDA. And we had something that was a genuine counterweight to the way certainly the leaders at the time were thinking. I think we need to up the level that it really is symmetrical to where the Chinese leadership is with things like BRI.
Good point. So I would like to bring you in here also, Charles. I mean, we have to have stable relationships with both the US and China. So to the whole panel, I mean, how do we finesse this?
Well, I think the most important thing is to ensure we do have a stable relationship with both parties. It's slightly difficult with one of the parties that is sometimes a little bit unpredictable right now. But with China, I think there was some evidence that things weren't quite where we wanted them to be a few months ago. I'm really pleased that the Prime Minister and Minister Parker have taken ownership of the relationship and have, I think the Chinese are much, much happier now with things with the Prime Minister and Mr. Parker being so obviously on top of things. A lot of work still to be done on that, but we can't navigate these choppy waters, to use your title, unless we do have those stable relationships with the United States. Obviously, there are some issues, but I think we need to be working as hard as we can at ministerial level, at senior officials level, to try and keep that relationship going, and we're just going to have to accept that there will be continuing surprises. You know, we got one today with President Trump announcing potentially new tariffs on Friday vis-a-vis China. I am worried, obviously, about if things get worse, the impact on our trade, both directly and indirectly, and we're just going to have to be super vigilant. And one of the beauties of being a small economy is we can shift reasonably quickly if we have to, and take advantage of the situation.
Andrew, just looking at both China and US business, how did it get so polarized so quickly?
Well, look, I mean, I think when you look at the nature of strategic competition, people do forget that from the time of Christ to about 150 years ago, China was 35% of the world's economy. So in their view, this is not the emergence of China. This is just the return of China to a very, very long-term position that they held in the world. So I think when great powers go up against each other, I think you always get these sorts of challenges. I think for New Zealand, the really important thing that we need to look at, and I go back to Kissinger, when Kissinger really reset the relationship between China and the US, he argued that the most valuable asset that the US could build was a cadre of individuals that really understood both places, that could speak the language. And the US invested significantly in a generation of about 100 leaders that really understood both ways and could intercede and resolve some of those things. Now, I think, and Fran, this was actually you about nearly 20 years ago with the US, where you pointed out that if we looked at the Australian relationship with the US, Australia's actually got a cadre of leaders on both sides that really understand, has access, understands the strategic and trade and business relationships. I think New Zealand has let those relationships with the US atrophy, and I don't think we've yet built them to the depth that they need to have in China going forward. I think we genuinely need a cadre of 20 to 30 people that really are deeply involved, get the relationship, and that we can call on when things go wrong, because things will go wrong, and I think this is the new normal. We're going to have more of these flare-ups every year, and we need people that can intelligently intercede to just make sure that little problems don't become big problems.
Charles, you were on the ground of that initiative as well.
Yeah, look, I think I agree absolutely. And I think it's important to stress that with both the United States relationship and the China relationship, we need to get over partisanship, and we need to be drawing upon expertise wherever it might lie in terms of keeping those personal relationships going. So I would have no issue with, say, someone like John Key, if he had a relationship with a particular Chinese leader, just leveraging that as much as we can on behalf of New Zealand, or whether it be Mike Moore. We have to be very smart, or Helen Clark. Yeah, we have to be very smart about this, and we're a small country. We just have to do that.
Is there perhaps room for an eminent persons group to help New Zealand?
Well, we have, we do have a NZ-US Council. We've got a China Council. That's a major achievement. I think we just have to make sure both are properly designed and remain relevant.
Okay. Now to bring in the audience here. Thank you, all of you. First question. On balance, does the panel see the impact of China-US trade war as having a generally positive or negative impact for New Zealand?
Well, I'm very worried about it. I don't think it has had a overly negative impact yet, but it has the potential to do so, and we just have to see the list of products that are going to be in the greatest deal ever signed, should it be signed in the next few weeks.
Yeah, Fran, I can tell you another thing that's hotly debated in Australia at the moment is, if a deal doesn't get done, then we're worried about what that means for global confidence. But the other problem is you need to worry about what happens if a deal does get done, because Trump is pretty clear what he wants. He wants to sell more US products into China. So look, I'm not going to comment on New Zealand's exports to China, but what about Australian LNG? What about Australian beef? What about Australian wine? The simplest way to get a deal done would for China to simply say, well, we'll import it from the US rather than Australia, or perhaps New Zealand. Now, clearly that's a pretty disastrous outcome for smaller economies that rely on international rules of trade to protect their interests. And of course, the other problem is that all this negotiating is taking place outside the World Trade Organization. In fact, it's undermining the World Trade Organization. The US, as we all know at the moment, is blocking the appointment of new judges to the dispute settlement body at the WTO. That will cease to function in December. These are big issues for countries like New Zealand and Australia.
Fran, the other point I'd make, I just think the climate, not only China, US and New Zealand, is becoming more challenging. It's for the world. It's becoming more challenging. But I also think the opportunity in that is all of the free trade agreements are still at some way wedded to a post-Bretton Woods 1940s view of an economy. Economies are much more about services, data, human capital, etc. I think New Zealand with China still has an opportunity to create a 21st century back relationship, much more anchored on human capital, infrastructure, data. And that actually, I think China would find that interesting in a way that we could set a bit of a blueprint in the way that we did with the original free trade agreement. Because I just think the old world, that's going to get harder and harder. And in the new world going forward, smaller players like ourselves, it's just going to be a tougher game.
Views from the rest of the panel?
Agree, and just in terms of US-China relations, I should point out that what we're seeing right now is just a more extreme version of what began as a debate under the Obama administration, and I have to say that the China hawks are ascendant in Washington, not just because of Donald J. Trump. So this is something we might have to deal with for many years.
Yeah, absolutely. This has got very little to do with Donald Trump, in fact. I mean, if you listen to what's coming out of Washington, it's a bipartisan view. And I think the challenge for New Zealand and Australia is to listen to what's coming out of Washington, of course, pay them their due respect, but subject it to facts and evidence. And some of the rhetoric that's coming out of Washington is frankly disturbing. We heard, for example, the chief US trade representative describe China as the world's most mercantilist country. Well, mercantilism means that you try to beef up your exports, artificially reduce your imports. Well, what's China's current account balance at the moment? In fact, it's in deficit. There are plenty of other countries around the world that have a much larger trade and current account surplus than China does. So this is just pretty simple, basic economic data, and it's contradicting some of the stories, some of the narratives that are coming out of Washington. So it's important we keep our eyes open.
So just following on that, what's the risk in trade and economic exposure to China as they ramp up economic and political pressure on us to join their worldview of trade and friendly relations? Is there a risk?
Well, I think every company is going to have to take a risk. I don't think the New Zealand government should be dictating positions. But I think all New Zealanders are aware that we once experienced the downside of being too exposed to a particular jurisdiction, and it took us many, many years to correct from that situation, so we wouldn't want to replicate it. And that's the beauty of the free trade agreement network that we actually have right now. With, a huge proportion of our trade now is covered, and it's going to be a bigger network when the EU joins. So we have got options to trade elsewhere.
I mean, Fran, the only, and again, I completely agree with Charles's view that the one thing I would add is that there's just this point about being strategic and being longer term. China, and we talked about the NDRC a little bit, they are very good, they are very purposeful, and they are very long term in their thinking. I just think we also need to do the same and make sure that we don't give away elements of what makes us valuable today, that we find ourselves in a strategically much weaker position in a decade's time, be that around our dairy industry, be that around some of our other things. And again, it's not about, it's just being purposeful and being a thoughtful counterparty, as opposed to having a 3-year time frame where they have a 50-year time frame. We know that won't end well.
So we're talking here about determining our own point of comparative advantage and value. Absolutely. Yeah, okay. Another shout out to you, Andrew, from Anonymous. Talks about you having a macro view on new rules of relationships between each country. Quite a key question here, really. Do we have to update foreign policy to win the game as a small player?
Well, look, the one thing that I do think, and again it was talked about a little bit this morning, I think around foreign policy, having this reputation as the honest broker and being very principled, and that's what I couldn't agree with you more about, being principled, being fact-based. I think the world needs that sort of foreign policy brand more than ever. And therefore, I think that in the sense of updating, that our processes are even more transparent, are higher quality. I mean, one of the issues that I have with the OIO at the moment is we're almost using bureaucracy as a way to follow policy, rather than having a policy that's very clear and a bureaucratic process that's consistent and professional alongside that. So I do think it needs updating, but I think in many respects the updating is going back to the touchstones of what we're most proud of anyway around fact-based, the honest broker, but making sure we're also the best little place to do business with, that around the professionalism of what our processes are. And we have to say the OIA, the OIO is not where we would like it to be at the moment, given those things.
James, in Australia, you do have the FIRB, and the Treasurer is also the central minister when it comes to determining the economic advantage or national interest around foreign investment. That's not the case here. Does that work well for Australia?
Look, I think it generally does, and the times we've gotten into trouble in the past haven't so much been about FIRB, but it's been the way things have been managed. For example, we had a very high-profile New South Wales electricity grid distributor that had 2 Chinese bidders bidding for it, and they were told everything was fine, going through the hurdles, and then right at 1 minute to midnight, they were declared a national security threat. Now that clearly didn't go down well, and I think that's probably one of the big lessons from Australia. It's often not the policies that the issue, it's how you handle things. I mean, I think about the deterioration in the Australian government and the Chinese government's relationship as well. It's often been the rhetoric, not so much the policy. I mean, Australia, of course, any country can decide, you know, how open your foreign investment regime is going to be. Any country can decide what rules you put in place around foreign interference. I have never had a Chinese diplomat complain to me, for example, about Australia's foreign interference laws. Right? What I have had Chinese diplomats complain to me about was that when Australia introduced those laws, our Prime Minister singled China out as part of the motivation for their introduction. Indeed, he even spoke in Mandarin to try to make his point. So you've got to be really careful with that rhetoric, not just the policy.
I think we might have touched on this a bit by talking about the NDRC, but New Zealand often thinks other countries can learn from us. Sometimes that's true. But what can we genuinely learn from China as a pillar for our relationship?
Do you want to? Well, look, the couple of things around China that I would love, and several folk talked about this morning. I really worry in New Zealand, the infrastructure debt that we now have in this country is becoming an inequity issue in terms of, so I think when you look at the way China does infrastructure, there is so much to learn. And I also think the positive, I mean, yes, we've run into some troubled water with Huawei and 5G. I love my Chinese colleagues are so proud of one stat. They always point out that historically, the country with the most kilometres of high-speed rail was Germany, with about 6,500. China is approaching 85,000 kilometres of high-speed rail. They then ask, how many kilometres do you think the US has? And the answer to the question is 22 kilometres. And both of those are at Disney World and Disneyland, which is sort of quite... But when you think about what we will need for the future of our economy around infrastructure, the pace at which China can build, the cost, the effect. I think learning about how we could do infrastructure the Chinese way, for me, is a massive opportunity. I also think just around when we know the future of the world, future of work around STEM, I find the way the Chinese education system, what it is doing around STEM at all levels, is extraordinary. I mean, if you look at Tsinghua today versus MIT, it's truly confronting for the Americans around where Tsinghua has got to. So I think when you look at the future, I mean, Minister Parker also, we were just talking about Chinese innovation. We have the privilege of taking many boards, New Zealand and Australian boards, to Silicon Valley, and we also take them to Shenzhen. The technology you will see in Shenzhen is half the price and twice the quality of what you will see in Silicon Valley today. So I think that's another, I mean, infrastructure, innovation, STEM, and how you do education for the future of these things, I think are just three small areas, well, not small areas, but three dimensions that I think we could learn a huge amount from the way China does it.
I agree with all that, and I think more broadly, there is the thinking longer term, you know, just not thinking in terms of 3-year cycles is something we can learn from China and other jurisdictions, and also the importance of investing in personal relationships. Again, they do it well, and it's something that's actually not just a China thing. We should be doing it as New Zealand more with other jurisdictions.
One of the issues which has come up is looking at the new platforms around for instance, WeChat, what's happening with Alibaba, Amazon, and so forth. I mean, how do we decide as a nation who we go with? Because we're small, we don't have major investment dollars, and how do we also cope with the fact that there is an issue in China around data privacy and protection?
Look, I think we have to be willing to adopt a wide range of technologies. And what concerns me a little bit is we're perhaps too focused on platforms that actually can't play in China. And I was laughing to myself the other day when I saw the fact that New Zealand political parties actually have got Chinese-based social media platforms launched as being regarded as a really negative thing and suspicious. Actually, it's a smart way of doing business, and I hope New Zealand companies follow the two major political parties into this space.
That's a very good point. Charles, this is a question for you. Do you see New Zealand playing an increasingly key role as the location for China-US business activity. And this is this independent archipelago of ours, such as New Zealand hosting the China-US feature film, The Meg.
Yeah, and you know, one of the strategic reasons for us doing our free trade agreement with China was always to try and be a point used by jurisdictions that didn't have as good a relationship with China. You know, so if you're McDonald's, you'd buy New Zealand beef to sell into China and sell it at a lower duty. But we should be doing this in a wide range of spheres, and I'm particularly pleased, given my background and also some of the people in this room, that the film cooperation is really, there's been a long-term investment, but it's delivering some really exciting projects right now, and I hope it continues. And it's the sort of relationship that can be totally transformative and will have benefits beyond just film and television.
Just for a panel view, critics have raised a fear that Huawei would be forced to hand over 5G data to the Chinese government if asked for it because of Chinese national security laws. Panel view on that?
Well, I think probably none of us are national security experts, so I'm a bit reluctant to comment. But what is clear is that if Chinese hackers wanted to get access to our data, they wouldn't necessarily have to do it through Huawei, right? I mean, that was the point that was raised before. Actually, I was just reading an article the other day where Cisco systems, about 9 backdoors were revealed in the last 12 months. So a lot of the technical experts that I speak to, they say, look, if you're worried about data security, the most important thing is to have a diversity of suppliers and have some competition as well, so that all those suppliers try to live up to the game of providing the best security they can. I think that's about all I can say.
Okay.
Look, the only thing I would say is that also, I mean, I'm a huge fan of the need for our China-New Zealand relationship to work. The risks around doing business in China and such like, those risks haven't gone away. And I think the cyber risk is there, but it's actually no more prominent than many of the other risks and challenges that you have. So I think we've sort of got the conversation somewhat out of kilter, in my view, relative to, there are still lots of other challenges that you have to navigate. But I think disengaging is absolutely the wrong strategy. Now is the moment to lean forward and lean in and engage more, rather than sort of being fearful and taking a step back.
I'm conscious of the time pressure on the next panel, which will have a fire alarm at 1. So what I'm going to do now is wrap up with this panel and just ask each of you, obviously there's a great deal more we could cover, but in summary, how best does New Zealand navigate choppy waters? Starting with you, Charles.
Well, I think the most important thing is to maintain the independent stance that we have maintained so well for the last 15 or so years. We've walked the tightrope between the two big powers very well, and we shouldn't make a radical change in position without there being a very serious domestic debate in New Zealand. And if there was a change signalled last year, there wasn't that debate, and it took everyone by surprise, if it's true. People tell me it's not, so that's great. So let's learn from that.
My Chinese colleagues have a saying now about China. They argue that it's become so large, it's so diverse, and it's changing so quickly that almost whatever you say about China is true. Somewhere in China you will find some part that represents your view. So a little bit my view is that given that, and given the smallness of New Zealand, we've got so much opportunity to engage with the great bits of China. And I think we should really find those points of common ground and interests that we're comfortable with and double down on those and really go for it. And then I think for the matters where we will have disagreement, to Charles's point, maintain our straight back and our fact-based, principled, this is who we are, and I think China respects that and understands that.
Yeah, my key point would be that engagement is always better than not. I know you folks were worried here about when a Prime Minister's visit might occur. We had 18 months where not a single Australian government minister went to China. More than 2 years passed before our foreign minister went to China. So that doesn't make for a great relationship. And I think there was a few problems there, but I think this is a key point. Where there will be areas we disagree, but then you've got to work hard to find out those areas where you can actually cooperate. And I think that's the problem Australia found itself in. While we were having these challenges, there weren't a lot of other areas that we were actually talking to China. And certainly, if you can't get your ministers up there for 18 months, that's certainly that's something you want to avoid.
Thank you very much. It's been a very honest, frank and robust discussion from the panel. You would appreciate that this is a difficult area for people to comment in because it all gets interpreted different ways depending on your perspectives. But I think we've had some very interesting insights from our panel into the geostrategic issues that confront us and some good pointers as to how we can actually navigate as a nation, but also business, in these choppy waters that we have faced. Please thank the panel